also another book coming out of that, which will be also completed in the course of this year. And at the moment, he is a research associate lecturer at the Institute for Islamic Studies at the University of Berlin. And in his current research, he focuses on Ottoman legal culture, cultural history, as well as Islamic normativity and public morality in the Middle East. Please help me welcome him.
Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction and the chance to present my findings on food and status. Before I start my lecture, I have to confess I do what some American university presses do. I have chosen a broader title and have chosen Greater Syria, but actually most of my examples are taken from Tripoli in Lebanon, but back then I would say it was part of but some of my conclusions can be definitely applied to a larger region and not only Greater Syria alone. I will start my talk with a proverb collected in the late Ottoman times that reads Arab doyunca yer, Türk ölünce yer. For all of you who do not understand Turkish or my pronunciation, it can be translated: the Arab eats until he's full or satisfied, and the Turk eats until he bursts or even dies because he ate too much. This proverb, however, at first sight ascribes practices of food consumption and habitus to particular ethnic groups, yet the Ottoman use of the word Türk articulates until the early 20th century also a kind of pejorative social connotation. The proverb illustrates, like numerous other examples, to what extent food and the practices of its consumption help to demarcate lines of distinction within a society, between religious, ethnic, especially social groups, and oftentimes between the rural and the urban population. What one ate, what one didn't, in which quantities, in which way and manner one ate, generated these distinctions. They marked fine lines of difference that excluded, for instance, nouveau riche, kept social climbers in their place, or even helped them to orchestrate themselves as the new trendsetters towards established elites and their old-fashioned practices. The 19th century Ottoman case marked a very dynamic period in which food culture, practices of food consumption experienced major shifts embedded within a larger framework of domestic lifestyle culture. In my talk, I will focus on these transitions in relation with their physical and social environment and relate practices with contemporary discourses on food, refined manners, conduct of life, articulated in journals that on a, let's say, normative level orchestrated and directed these changes. I will discuss how these changes in discourses affected consumption practices in a provincial town like Tripoli, in today's Lebanon, and which parts of society were targeted by these discourses and had the means to purchase new items and participate in these new practices of food culture. Doubtlessly, food and other commodities traveled between different world regions in the Middle East long before the heyday of modernity. In the early modern period, this exchange brought coffee, sorbet, and tulips from the Ottoman Empire to Europe, tobacco, potatoes, and tomatoes from the New World through Europe into the Ottoman Empire. This transfer was not, however, limited to food and dishes alone. Implements, furniture, and cultural practices accompanied these commodities in both directions and were adapted as well as incorporated into established forms of consumption and hospitality. What might have distinguished the late Ottoman times from earlier periods is the speed, the extent, range of this influx of new dishes, food items and practices. Steamships, for example, and railways allowed goods to be transported quickly and across large distances, making foreign luxury goods more accessible and everyday mass-produced products more affordable. At the same time, some Arab journals, like Al-Muqtataf, I will introduce later, served as a kind of normative lifestyle manuals that reached a trans-regional and almost globalized audience. Contrary to, as one might think, that European-style items for the preparation, display, and consumption of food, that together with certain practices promised the gain of distinction, were not limited to rather small urban elites alone. During the late Ottoman period, various consumer goods from abroad reached the markets of Greater Syria and made some of these commodities, like European kitchen and dinnerware, textile goods, available and affordable for large parts of the society. This trend is reflected in inheritance inventories of a variety of people from different social groups. I just gave you one example of a quite longer of these inventories, and the list of items starts here and ends up here. This is a larger one, sometimes you have only a few items, but from these inventories you can learn a lot about consumption patterns and trends. This trend was reflected in these inventories, and these documents contained long lists of items of a deceased person and what he owned, and especially it lists things which were publicly auctioned after somebody died. And I gave you two examples. On the right side you have the item, it's like let's say European or Western plates. Then you have the number 5 and then the price. And the other example I gave you, it reads Schweie Basal, to return to the basal, to the onion, shows you that even small amounts of foodstuff were also listed, and there's a debate about the accuracy of these lists, but I would, from my reading impressions, I would say they listed everything, sometimes even a broken watch, which had almost no value, was also listed in these inventories. From these lists, it's quite obvious that European-style kitchenware and things related to the preparation and especially serving of food seem to have reached a provincial town like Tripoli much earlier and with a broader social spread than any other everyday European product. Since the late 1840s, artisans in Tripoli with a rather mediocre income possessed and used European-style kitchen and dinnerware. For example, a miller and a butcher, they died around 1850 in Tripoli, owned, for example, European goods as plates, like you can see it, spoon ifrangier, glasses, cassette, ifrangier, and also a set of European-style coffee cups, fanagine ifrangier. Both artisans came from a rather lower income group, even within their own craft, and therefore it's not very surprisingly that all of these European-style goods were extremely inexpensive, with the plates and glasses worth a little bit more than half a piaster. And this price was compared to similar products in the bequest. Sometimes these local products were 5 times or 7 times more than these European goods. The low price might have attracted them to purchase these things, but doubtlessly their design and shape was clearly identifiable as foreign or European, so that the scribe of the Islamic court who set up the list of the bequests added the signifier frangi to these items, expressing this aspect. And this implied connotation of being modern and to a certain extent affluent might also attracted these artisans to buy and use these things, which were related to the hosting of guests and serving food and beverages. In this regard, it seemed that European-style kitchenware was available for and preferred by broad parts of society, like average income artisans, long before other kind of commodities diffused into the property of these groups. In comparison, European-style clothing can hardly be found in the bequests at this time, and Western-style furniture came even later at the end of the century and was rather an elite phenomenon. In addition, the property structure of men and women from a rather well-off and socially up-moving artisan background show at the end of the 19th century kitchenware items in number and value as at least 1/3, and sometimes, as you can see here, much more, which can be understood as the importance of kitchenware within these milieus, which were socially mobile and gained a certain social position, and kitchenware seemed to be a way to represent oneself to others. Sure, clothing was also important, but as you can see, kitchenware seemed to be the focus of investment. This influx of European consumer goods and items since the 1870s happened in a time when one of the most significant transitions of domestic culture and housing occurred. The trend from multifunctional residential spaces to a differentiated room program that marked one of the most visible distinctions within the late Ottoman society. Before these changes occurred, multifunctional rooms were the norm. Rich and poor, people with larger mansions, as well as smaller dwellings, used often living spaces for different purposes. Like one space was used for gathering, eating, sleeping, and sometimes even cooking. In the late Ottoman period, urban elites, but also a certain part of mid-range income families, started to extend or modify their domestic spaces so that particular rooms served often a single purpose, like a dining room, a sleeping room, a room for gatherings, and so on. The central hall house, maybe most of you are familiar with that, and the rooms evolved around it, is almost the physical ideal type of a differentiated room program of middle and upper class housing culture. But also more hybrid forms of this differentiation process can be found in the houses of middle income groups or more affluent artisans that had not the means or not the space to construct a central hall. This shift had major impacts on furniture, food consumption, practices of the domestic life within these newly configured spaces. While furniture used in multifunctional rooms, it had to be practical and movable to store it when the room was used for other purposes. But now with these differentiated rooms, furniture was stable and permanent and was not moved around because there was no necessity. And so we find a set of new items and furniture like tables, chairs, wardrobes, and so on. And as we will see below, those physical transitions corresponded with a discourse on new practices of lifestyle and domestic culture. Despite these changes in residential spaces, we should not forget that the vast majority of the society in Greater Syria could not follow this trend and was at least until the end of the Ottoman Empire excluded from these new practices generated by and within these spaces. Many people, as you can see, lived in one or two multifunctional rooms, shared often a kitchen or even a courtyard with other families, what affected the extent of privacy, but also the means of cooking food and receiving visitors. One rather extreme example you can see here is the so-called Haus, which is a collective courtyard housing in which a considerable part of the population lived, and that also shows some features you can also find in houses of quite better off part of the population. Haus in general, I will explain it to you, was a set of several single chambers. You can see that on the right. And these single chambers were, in a way, grouped around a courtyard, you can see in the middle. And sometimes people shared a kitchen together. In this example, there's no kitchen, but there were shared bathroom facilities. These courtyards, or this kind of housing, can be understood as a semi-private space at best, where, for example, notions of gender segregation could hardly be realized. And women, for example, sitting in the courtyard, could not dress as if they would be in a more private environment, which affected definitely gatherings and also the preparation of food. the people who could afford the luxury of privacy, as I would call it, and to modify their houses into more differentiated room program, which was approximately a quarter of Tripoli's population, were very entangled in a transregional discourse on domestic living culture. This spatially more distinguished part of society did cut through religious lines and did not only comprise the group of affluent soap merchants, landowners, and some ulama families, but also in part people from an artisan background, which gained social mobility and became quite affluent as a kind of small entrepreneurs. This discourse generated in the light of transforming residential spaces a set of new practices and was orchestrated by journals like Al-Muqtataf I mentioned before. The transregional conversation on food, as it was formulated in such journals, was embedded in a broader discursive framework addressing an idealized modern family life and lifestyle, home-based family upbringing and education of children, as well as the refinement of manners and morals. It's always difficult to evaluate the audience and spread of such publications, but an analysis from letters to the editors by readers and the analysis where they came from over a period of several decades hints, at least since the mid-1880s, to a really diverse transregional and I would say almost global readership. We have readers from provincial cities in Greater Syria like Homs, Hama, Tripoli, Jabal Lubnan, Mount Lebanon, rural areas in Syria and Egypt, Anatolia, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, and readers in Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, and London. Religiously, the readership in the beginning was predominantly Christian, but after a very short period of time, the journal became very popular also among Muslim subscribers. The journal covered a broad variety of topics from science, agricultural innovations, but introduced several years after its foundation a large section on domestic life, which was called Tatbir al-Manzil, that promoted new practices and lifestyles. It focused on the upbringing of children, home-based education, health and sanitary issues, but gave also advice on table manners, furniture, the color of the walls of these modified and new houses. And these normative and prescriptive articles gave always negative and positive examples in order to correct inappropriate practices and manners, and was in general like forbidding the wrong and commanding the right in terms of lifestyle. He debated why young women shouldn't read French novels, or how particular rooms should be used, or as you can see on the slide, the right way to sit was also, the right way to sit was also debated at length. The overarching theme of many articles of this section was refinement, tahdhib, of manners and morals as a central element that generated a particular habitus and defined an etiquette for the use of residential spaces, the education of children, and in general domestic lifestyle. Numerous articles appeared like Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, Tahdhib al-Banat, and so on. And so we have like a variety of articles which had it in the title or at least in their text. This theme appeared almost everywhere. In regard to food culture, that was part of this broader discourse, the journal section tackled matters of hygiene, cleanliness, discussed furniture in dining rooms, the right way to use forks and knives, the right time to eat, suitable table conversations, or promoted new European-style kitchen and dinnerware. Although some new recipes for food and beverages were presented, but it was not necessarily what you ate, which maybe granted you distinction, but how you ate it, and the practices evolved around eating, which were at the center of interest and promised this distinction. As it's often the case, and as we have discussed in former panel sessions, one has to evaluate the impact factor of normative texts on actual practices. Doubtlessly, for many middle and upper class families in Greater Syria, Egypt and beyond, Al-Muqtataf was an influential manual for lifestyle and food culture. A more interactive section of the journal, where readers ask questions about domestic culture, suggests how much people were involved into debates on lifestyle and how these suggested lifestyles were adapted to particular settings all over the Middle East and sometimes even in the Americas. In this section, the editors of the journal responded in a question and answer format and giving a kind of lifestyle fatwa on the right conduct of life in these new houses. In addition, one case from Tripoli, the mention of the affluent Atara family, you can see here on the slides, now maybe not in a really proper condition, but it helps us to see the color of the walls. This is maybe the good thing about destruction. You can see that this family quite immediately applied certain suggestions Al-Muqtataf made. In one article, the journal discussed which colors which of these rooms should have, and this family applied the color scheme which was suggested, and as I learned from an interview during my research period from a family member, is that when the family moved from Tripoli to Beirut and built a new house, they kept the same color scheme also for the new mansion. So there must be like a certain impact of the discourse on certain practices. This one is a really visible one. And in general, you could say Al-Muqtataf served as a guidance for refined lifestyle decisions, and it was lively debated and embodied in an ideal form, which particular families selected maybe elements to represent their social position and gained social distinction. And Muqtataf was maybe always like a place where you could look if your decisions and your lifestyle was correct, or if you had to, in a way, fine-tune it in one way or the other. In conclusion, the shifts of residential spaces from multifunctional rooms to a more differentiated program of rooms with a single function was accompanied by a discourse on domestic life and lifestyle, promoted in journals like Al-Muqtataf, with a religiously and geographically mixed trans-regional readership and a broad perception from Greater Syria and Egypt to the Americas. This audience became more and more unified by similar tastes, lifestyles, and social practices that constituted, in a way, an imagined community of tastes and lifestyles. Oh, I'm not done. Practices of food consumption were part of this program of refinement and helped to distinguish social climbers from old established elites and to profile themselves through a modern and refined lifestyle. For social groups, for instance, from an artisan background, that in part had the means to participate in these changes and new practices, but also for some people from this professional group who still lived in multifunctional rooms, in particular European-style kitchen and dinnerware and items related to the display and serving of food were important to participate, at least to a certain extent, in these new practices, and help this, let's say, lower end of the middle class to express a particular status and modern lifestyle even within these multifunctional rooms. Thank you.